Family ignored me for 8 years after my marriage. Now they beg to see my kids at school. The irony is so thick I could cut it with a knife. For 8 years, I was a ghost to them, a cautionary tale whispered at their lavish dinner parties. I, Lauren, the daughter who threw away a legacy for love. My crime was marrying Daniel, a man with a brilliant mind and a heart of gold, but with a bank account that didn't meet my family's standards. He was a scholarship kid, the son of a mechanic, and in their world, that was an unforgivable sin. They ignored me for 8 years, then begged to see my kids. The irony is thick. My father, John, called me a disgrace for loving Daniel. Subscribe and leave a like to see where this defiance led me. I remember the day I told them we were engaged. We were in my father's study, a room that smelled of old leather and disapproval. My father, John, sat behind his massive mahogany desk, his fingers steepled, a cold, calculating look in his eyes. My mother, Carol, wrung her hands, looking anywhere but at me. And my older sister, Alexis, stood by the fireplace, a smug little smile playing on her lips. She always enjoyed my failures. "A software engineer?" my father had said, the words dripping with disdain. "Lauren, we had a future planned for you. A merger with the Harrison family. You were supposed to marry their son, secure our dynasty." I looked at Daniel, who stood beside me, his hand holding mine tightly. He was nervous, but he stood tall. "I love him, Dad," I said, my voice shaking but firm. "Love doesn't pay for the yacht club membership," Alexis chimed in, examining her perfectly manicured nails. "It doesn't get you a table at the best restaurants or a wing in the museum named after you." The ultimatum was swift and brutal. If I married Daniel, I would be cut off. No inheritance, no trust fund, no family name to open doors for me. I would be on my own, disowned. They were so certain I would crumble, that I would choose their cold, gilded cage over a life of uncertainty with the man I loved. They underestimated me. They underestimated Daniel. We got married in a small courthouse ceremony with 2 of Daniel's friends as witnesses. The first few years were hard. We lived in a tiny 1-bedroom apartment with peeling paint and a radiator that clanked all night. I worked 2 jobs while Daniel poured every waking hour and every spare dollar into his startup, Synapse Dynamics. There were nights we ate nothing but instant noodles and shared a single can of soda, dreaming of a future that seemed impossibly far away. Through it all, there was silence from my family. No calls on my birthday, no card at Christmas, not even a text when our daughter Lily was born, followed by our son Caleb 2 years later. They had erased me. Then, Daniel's hard work paid off. Synapse Dynamics exploded. His software, an innovative logistics platform, was acquired by a tech giant for a sum that made my father's old money fortune look like pocket change. Suddenly, we weren't the struggling couple in a rundown apartment. We were the new power players in the city. We built a sprawling, modern house on a cliff overlooking the ocean, the kind of place my family would kill to be invited to. But the real symbol of our arrival, the one they couldn't ignore, was Northwood Preparatory Academy. It's the most exclusive private school in the state, with a $50,000 a year tuition and a waiting list that stretches back generations. My family had always bragged about their legacy status there. Alexis's children were enrolled, of course. They assumed my kids would never even get an interview. They didn't count on us making a multi-million-dollar donation to build their new science and technology wing. Lily and Caleb weren't just accepted. The school rolled out the red carpet for them. That's when the silence broke. My phone buzzed last night with a text from a number I didn't have saved, but I knew instantly who it was. It was from Alexis. "Hey, Lore," it read, dripping with a sickeningly sweet fakeness. "Long time no see. Heard Lily and Caleb are at Northwood. That's amazing. My little ones are there too. We should totally do a family day at the school fair next week. The kids would love to meet their cousins. It's been too long. XOXO." I stared at the message, a cold fury rising in my chest. 8 years of nothing. 8 years where I cried myself to sleep, wondering what was so wrong with me that my own mother and father could pretend I didn't exist. 8 years of them bad-mouthing my husband, the man who built an empire from scratch while they sat on their inherited wealth and judged the world. Now, because my children attend a prestigious school and carry a name that has become synonymous with success, They want to play happy families. They don't want to see me. They want to be seen with me. They want access to the world Daniel and I built, a world they tried so hard to keep me from having. They thought they could just close a door on me for 8 years and then knock politely when it suited them. They had no idea that I was the one who had changed the locks. I showed the phone to Daniel, my hand trembling slightly, not from fear, but from a rage so pure it felt like ice in my veins. He was sitting on the edge of our infinity pool, looking out at the city lights twinkling below. He took the phone, his brow furrowing as he read the message from Alexis. After a moment, he looked up at me, his expression unreadable. "Well," he said, handing it back. "I guess 8 years is the statute of limitations on familial shame." I let out a laugh that had no humor in it. They don't feel shame, Daniel. They feel envy. They see our name on the new science wing at Northwood, and they smell opportunity. This isn't an olive branch. It's a prospecting tool. He stood up and wrapped his arms around me, pulling me close. His embrace was the same one that had held me together in our tiny, freezing apartment when we couldn't afford to turn the heat up. It was the anchor I had clung to when I found out I was pregnant with Lily, and my mother, Carol, didn't answer my call. "We don't have to go," he said softly into my hair. "We don't owe them anything. We can block the number and go on with our lives, the lives we built." Part of me wanted that, the simple, clean break. But another darker part of me knew it wouldn't be enough. Ignoring them felt like letting them win, like allowing them to believe they could just sweep 8 years of cruelty under a Persian rug and pretend it never happened. They needed to see what they had thrown away. They needed to understand the magnitude of their miscalculation. I remembered one winter when Lily was 3. She had a terrible fever, a respiratory infection that wouldn't break. The local clinic doctor was worried and suggested a specialist, but our insurance was terrible and we had no savings. I swallowed my pride, my hands shaking as I dialed my mother's number from a payphone because our cell service had been cut off. It went to voicemail. I left a desperate, tearful message, begging for help, for a loan, for just a sign that she still cared if her granddaughter was okay. She never called back. Daniel ended up selling his grandfather's old watch, the one thing of value he had left, to pay for the specialist. Lily was fine, but a part of me broke that day. The part that still held out a sliver of hope for my family. "No," I said, pulling back from Daniel's embrace. "We're going to go." He looked at me, a question in his eyes. "We're going to go to the school fair," I continued, my voice growing stronger, colder. "We're going to take Lily and Caleb, and we're going to smile and be the perfect family. We're going to let Alexis introduce us to all her friends. We're going to let my father, John, see the man he called a penniless nobody standing next to the John and Carol Miller Science Wing sign." A slow smile spread across Daniel's face. He understood. This wasn't about reconciliation. It was about control. It was about showing them that the world they worshipped, the world of money, status, and power, was now our world. And they were no longer the gatekeepers. "My dad always used to say," Daniel said, his voice low, "that a debt always gets paid one way or another. Looks like it's time for them to settle their account." That phrase resonated deep within me. A debt always gets paid. They owed me for every tear I cried, for every meal we skipped, for every birthday they ignored. They owed me for making me feel worthless and for trying to break the best thing that ever happened to me. I took a deep breath, the cool night air steadying me. I picked up my phone and typed a reply to Alexis. My fingers moved with a calm, deliberate precision. "Alexis, how lovely to hear from you after all this time," I wrote. "Of course, we'll be at the fair. Lily and Caleb are so excited about their new school. Why don't we all meet at the dedication ceremony for the new science wing? Say, around noon? It would be the perfect place for the kids to finally meet. I'm sure Dad and Mom would want to be there for that moment too. It'll be a real family reunion." I hit send before I could second-guess myself. The trap was set. The location wasn't a casual meeting spot. It was a monument to our success, funded by the money they told me I'd never have. It was a stage, and I was no longer the scorned daughter. I was the producer, the director, and the star of this show, and my family had no idea they were about to be cast as the villains in their own downfall. I watched the 3 little dots appear as Alexis started typing her reply, a cold, triumphant smile on my face. The game was on. The reply from Alexis came back in less than a minute. It was nauseatingly cheerful, littered with emojis. OMG lore, the science wing. That's a perfect idea. Mom and Dad will be so thrilled to see you all. It's about time. We'll be there. Can't wait to finally meet my niece and nephew. XOXO. She had swallowed the bait whole, completely oblivious to the hook hidden inside. She thought my choice of location was a tribute, an olive branch. She had no idea it was a stage, carefully set to highlight everything they had lost and everything I had gained. The week leading up to the fair was a strange mix of calm and storm. On the surface, my life was perfect. I drove Lily and Caleb to school in our Tesla, past rows of mansions with perfectly manicured lawns. I had lunch with other moms at a country club my family had been on the waiting list for years to join. I approved designs for Daniel's new office building downtown. But underneath, a cold, hard knot of anticipation was tightening in my stomach. Every night, I'd lie awake next to Daniel, replaying the last 8 years in my head. I remembered the humiliation of having my credit card declined at the grocery store, the ache in my feet from working a double shift, the hollow feeling of celebrating Lily's first birthday with a single cupcake because it was all we could afford. These weren't just memories. They were fuel. On the morning of the fair, I stood in Lily's walk-in closet, a space larger than my first apartment's entire living room. I picked out a beautiful floral dress for her and a crisp linen shirt for Caleb. They looked like the children of privilege they now were, happy and carefree. Daniel came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist. He rested his chin on my shoulder, looking at our reflection in the mirror. "Are you ready for this?" he asked softly. I met his eyes in the reflection. His face was the same kind face I fell in love with, but the lines of worry and exhaustion from our early years were gone, replaced by a quiet confidence. "I'm not the same scared girl they threw out, Daniel. They're about to find that out." He smiled. "I know. Just remember, we can leave at any time. All you have to do is give me the signal." His unwavering support was my armor. We had built this life together, brick by brick, while they had tried to tear me down. They had failed. Arriving at Northwood Preparatory Academy was like entering another world. Ivy-covered brick buildings stood on rolling green hills, and the sound of a string quartet drifted from a large white tent on the main lawn. It was the epitome of old money and tradition, a place designed to make people like the old me feel inadequate. But today, I didn't feel inadequate. I felt like I owned the place. Because, in a way, I did. As we walked towards the center of the campus, I saw it. The new science wing was a stunning piece of modern architecture, all glass and steel, a stark contrast to the old-world style of the rest of the school. And there, in large, gleaming silver letters above the entrance, was the plaque. The John and Carol Miller Science and Technology Wing. I had insisted on the name. It was the ultimate power move. I had taken their names, the names they had tried to strip from me, and attached them to my success, forever linking them to the man they had rejected. From across the lawn, I spotted them, my family. They were standing near a refreshments table, looking perfectly in their element. Alexis was in a ridiculously expensive-looking sundress, laughing too loudly with another woman. My father, John, stood stiffly in a pastel polo shirt looking like the lord of the manor. My mother, Carol, was fidgeting with her pearl necklace, her eyes darting around the crowd. They looked exactly the same. They hadn't changed at all. They were relics, frozen in their world of prejudice and arrogance. Lily tugged on my hand. "Mommy, can we get a balloon?" "Of course, sweetie," I said, my voice steady, "right after we say hello to some people." I took a deep breath. This was it. 8 years of silence were about to come to a very loud end. I thought of Daniel's father's words, which he had shared with me so many times during our hardest days. He had been a simple mechanic, but he had an honor my own father could never comprehend. "A debt always gets paid, one way or another," he used to say. My family had run up an enormous debt with me, a debt of love, of support, of basic human decency. The bill was now due. I squeezed Daniel's hand, and together, with our beautiful children between us, we started walking towards them. We were a family, whole and strong, walking into the past to finally close the door on it forever. And they just stood there, smiling, waiting for a reunion, having no idea they were actually waiting for a reckoning. As we approached, it was Alexis who saw us first. Her face broke into a wide, practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. She detached herself from her conversation and practically glided towards us, arms outstretched. "Laure, you came!" she squealed, loud enough for half the lawn to hear. She wrapped me in a hug that felt like being embraced by a cold, scented mannequin. I didn't hug back. I just stood there, rigid, until she let go. "Hello, Alexis," I said, my voice even. She immediately knelt down to be at eye level with my children. "And you must be Lily and Caleb. Oh, you are just adorable. I'm your Auntie Alexis." She was laying on the charm so thick you could smell it, a cloying mix of expensive perfume and desperation. Lily politely said hello, while Caleb hid behind Daniel's leg. My sister didn't seem to notice or care. Her performance was for the audience of her friends, who were now watching with undisguised curiosity. My parents approached more slowly. My mother, Carol, looked pale, her hands twisting the strap of her handbag. "Lauren," she said, her voice a reedy whisper. It's good to see you." She made no move to hug me. Her eyes flickered towards Daniel and the children, then quickly away, as if looking at them for too long might cause her physical pain. The pain of acknowledging her own monumental failure as a mother. My father, John, was the last to arrive. He stood with his hands in the pockets of his tailored trousers, his posture radiating a forced casualness. He nodded at me, a curt, businesslike gesture. Then he turned his attention to Daniel. "Daniel," he said, extending a hand. "It's been a while. I've been reading about synapse dynamics. Impressive work." I watched, frozen, as Daniel shook my father's hand. The sheer audacity of it almost took my breath away. This was the same man who had called Daniel a worthless gold digger, who had predicted he'd leave me in a gutter within a year. Now he was talking about his company, his eyes gleaming with a new kind of respect. The respect one predator has for another who has made a bigger kill. "Thank you, John," Daniel said, his voice calm and steady. He wasn't intimidated. He had faced down venture capitalists and hostile boardrooms. My father was nothing. "We should talk about a possible synergy between our investment portfolios sometime," my father continued, completely ignoring me and the children. He saw Daniel not as his son-in-law, but as a new acquisition target. I stepped forward, placing a hand on Daniel's arm. "We're here for the school fair, Dad, for the kids." My voice was a sliver of ice cutting through his networking attempt. His gaze shifted to me, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes before it was masked. Of course. Family day." He said the word family as if it were a foreign object in his mouth. The 5 of us stood there in a circle of excruciating awkwardness. Alexis chattered on about her children's polo lessons. My mother stared at a point over my shoulder, and my father tried to assess the value of Daniel's watch. It was a pathetic, transparent display. They didn't want a family reunion. They wanted a merger. They wanted to absorb our success, to paste it over the cracks in their own aging dynasty. I thought back to all the nights I had wished for this, for them to see me, to want me back. But I had imagined tears, apologies, remorse. I had never imagined this empty, transactional charade. They hadn't changed. They had just recalculated the value of my stock. As I watched them, the words Daniel had told me his father used to say echoed in my mind. A debt always gets paid one way or another. They had no idea how steep their debt was, or that the collection was just beginning. "Well," Alexis said, clapping her hands together, "the dedication for the new wing is about to start. We have front row seats, of course. Legacy perks." She winked, as if we were sharing some inside joke. The irony was staggering. She was claiming legacy status at an event made possible by the very people her family had tried to destroy. "How perfect," I said, my smile feeling sharp and dangerous on my face. We wouldn't want to be late. I took Lily's hand, and Caleb took Daniel's. Together, we all turned and began walking toward the gleaming glass building, toward the stage set up in front of the enormous silver plaque bearing my parents' names. They walked ahead, puffed up with pride and self-importance, assuming this was their moment of glory. They thought the plaque was an honor, a tribute from a daughter who had finally seen the error of her ways. They had no idea it was a gravestone, a monument to the family they had willingly buried 8 years ago. And I was about to read the eulogy. The front row of white chairs was, as Alexis had boasted, reserved for them. They settled in like royalty, taking their thrones, my father positioning himself in the center, my mother and sister flanking him. They left no room for us. It didn't matter. I guided Daniel and the children to the row directly behind them, a perfect vantage point to watch the show. The air was thick with the scent of cut grass and old money. The headmaster of Northwood, a man with a mane of silver hair and a politician's smile, stepped up to the podium. A large velvet curtain concealed the plaque on the wall of the new science wing behind him. "Welcome parents, alumni, and friends of Northwood," he began, his voice booming through the speakers. "For over a century, this institution has been built on 2 pillars, tradition and progress. We honor the legacies of the families who have walked these halls for generations." I watched the back of my father's head. He straightened his posture, puffing out his chest. Alexis leaned over and whispered something to my mother, who gave a weak, tight-lipped smile. They thought this speech was about them. They believed their name, their history, was the only currency that mattered here. "And today," the headmaster continued, "we celebrate a monumental step forward, a leap into the future of science and technology, made possible by the extraordinary generosity of one of our most esteemed legacy families." He gestured vaguely towards my parents. The people around them began to applaud politely. John gave a magnanimous nod, as if accepting an award he had long known was his. "This new wing will ensure that Northwood remains at the forefront of education for the next century," the headmaster said. "And it is with great honor that I invite the patriarch of this remarkable family, Mr. John Miller, to the stage to say a few words and help us unveil the plaque." My father stood up. The applause grew louder. Alexis had her phone out, no doubt recording for her social media, her face glowing with smug pride. John walked to the stage with the self-assured gait of a man who had never been told no in his life. He shook the headmaster's hand and turned to the microphone. "Thank you," he started, his voice dripping with false humility. "My family has a long and storied history with Northwood. My grandfather helped fund the first library. My father sat on the board for 30 years. We believe in giving back, in upholding the standards that make this school the finest in the country. We are honored to continue that tradition today." He was painting a masterpiece of self-congratulation. He spoke of duty, of legacy, of the responsibility of the privileged. Every word was a subtle jab at me, at the life he thought I had chosen, a life without history or importance. He paused for effect, then turned and reached for the velvet rope that would unveil the plaque. This was his moment. And that's when the headmaster stepped forward again, a hand gently raised. "Mr. Miller, my sincerest apologies for the interruption," he said, his voice smooth but firm, carrying a hint of practiced urgency. "I fear my remarks may have caused a slight confusion." A confused murmur rippled through the crowd. My father froze, his hand hovering over the rope, a look of irritation crossing his face. The headmaster cleared his throat. "While we are, of course, eternally grateful for the Miller family's historical contributions, the funding for this magnificent $20 million facility was not a part of that." The silence was absolute. Alexis's phone slowly lowered. "The plaque is indeed named in honor of John and Carol Miller," the headmaster continued, his eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on me. "At the specific request of the sole benefactors, a gesture I was told to honor a family debt. It is my distinct pleasure to ask the true patrons of this project to join us on stage. Please welcome Ms. Lauren Miller and her husband, Mr. Daniel." It was like a switch had been flipped. Hundreds of heads turned in unison, first looking at my stunned family, then at us. I saw the exact moment the calculation registered on their faces. The shock, the disbelief, followed by a wave of burning, public humiliation. My father stood on the stage, a statue of indignation, his face turning a blotchy red. My mother looked like she might faint. And Alexis. Her face was a perfect mask of horror, her mouth slightly agape. I stood up, taking Daniel's hand. He gave it a reassuring squeeze. We walked down the aisle, past the rows of curious, whispering faces, past my family who looked at me as if I were a ghost rising from a grave they had personally dug. We walked up the steps to the stage, and my father, looking suddenly old and small, had no choice but to step aside. The headmaster shook our hands warmly and then discreetly stepped back, leaving me at the podium. I looked out at the crowd, at the sea of confused and intrigued faces. Then my eyes found my family. They were staring at me, their expressions a mix of fury and disbelief. They had thrown me out, erased me from their lives, and now I stood on their stage, in their world, holding all the power. I leaned into the microphone. "Thank you," I said, my voice clear and steady, ringing across the silent lawn. My father was just talking about tradition and legacy, and I'm here to talk about that too, specifically the tradition of paying one's debts. I paused, letting my words hang in the air, a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight on the perfectly manicured lawn of Northwood. My father, John, looks like a man who had been struck by lightning but was forced to remain standing. My mother, Carol, had a hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with a horror that was purely social. And Alexis, my dear sister, was staring at her phone as if hoping it would offer an escape hatch from this public nightmare. "A debt," I repeated, my voice calm, each word carefully chosen. A debt isn't always about money. Sometimes it's about what's promised, what's owed. For 8 years, I was told I had squandered my legacy, that I had chosen a life of insignificance. I was a ghost in my own family, a story told to frighten other daughters into obedience. I saw a flicker of something in my mother's eyes. Shame, maybe. My father's jaw was so tight I was surprised it didn't crack. My family believed in a very specific kind of value, I continued, turning my gaze slightly to sweep across the front rows, where the city's most powerful families sat. The value of a name, the value of inherited wealth. They couldn't see the value in a brilliant man with calloused hands, a man who built things with his mind instead of inheriting them. They couldn't see the value in love. I glanced at Daniel, who stood beside me, solid and calm. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. He knew this was my moment. My father mentioned his disapproval of my husband's career, a software engineer. He said it with such disappointment. I let a small, sad smile touch my lips. Well, that software engineer, the son of a mechanic, used his brilliant mind to create something from nothing. He started a small company in our garage, working 18-hour days while I taught second grade to pay our bills. We didn't have a family legacy to fall back on. We had to build our own. The murmur in the crowd started to grow, a low hum of understanding and recalculation. People were connecting the dots. That little company, the one my father wouldn't deign to ask about, developed a security protocol that is now used by nearly every major financial institution in the world. I let that sink in. 3 months ago, that company was acquired, and the money from that acquisition is what paid for this building. Every brick, every window, every blade of grass you're standing on. The silence returned, but this time it was laced with awe. Alexis finally looked up from her phone, her face a mask of disbelief and raw, ugly jealousy. She had spent 8 years reveling in what she thought was my failure, only to find out she'd been celebrating my secret triumph all along. "We decided to remain anonymous benefactors," I said, my voice softening just a little. "But we had one condition. The wing had to be named after John and Carol Miller, not to honor their contribution, but to settle a debt. The debt of family, the debt of support that was never given, the debt of faith that was never shown." I looked directly at my father. His face was no longer red with anger, but a waxy, pale color. He looked smaller on that stage, stripped of his power. "You see, Father? A true legacy isn't about protecting what you have. It's about building something that lasts, something that helps others. You taught me about the importance of a name. And you were right. A name should stand for something. Today, the Miller name stands for education, for opportunity, for giving kids from all backgrounds a chance to succeed. My husband and I made sure of that." I turned to Daniel. "Would you do the honors?" He stepped forward, past my frozen father, and took the velvet rope. With a firm pull, the curtain fell away, revealing the gleaming bronze plaque. It read, the John and Carol Miller Wing for Science and Innovation. And below that, in smaller letters, it said, "A gift from their children, Lauren and Daniel, who believe that every legacy begins with a single opportunity." A wave of polite, then enthusiastic applause broke out across the lawn. People were looking at my parents not with the reverence they expected, but with a mixture of pity and confusion. They were characters in a story that was no longer theirs to control. I stepped away from the podium, taking Daniel's hand again. The headmaster rushed forward, beaming, shaking our hands vigorously. "An incredible gesture, Ms. Miller. Truly incredible." As we were being led off the side of the stage, I saw my father finally move. He walked stiffly toward my mother and sister, his back rigid. He didn't look at me. Carol was openly crying now, dabbing her eyes with a silk handkerchief while Alexis was furiously typing on her phone, probably crafting some desperate narrative to spin this disaster to her friends. They had spent 8 years trying to erase me. But in one 10-minute speech, I hadn't just rewritten our family history. I had become its sole author. They were now just footnotes in my story. As we reached the bottom of the steps, a woman I vaguely recognized from my mother's charity circles, a woman named Beverly, stopped me. Her eyes were wide with a new calculating respect. "Lauren, darling," she gushed, grabbing my arm. "I had no idea. We must have lunch. There is so much to catch up on." The world my family had built, the world they had kicked me out of, was now knocking at my door. And I wasn't sure if I was going to answer. I smiled politely at Beverly, a tight, practiced smile I hadn't used in 8 years. "Lunch sounds lovely, Beverly, but we're so busy these days. I'll have my assistant check my schedule." I didn't have an assistant. The lie was a small, sharp pebble I tossed into the pond of her assumptions. Her eyes widened almost imperceptibly. An assistant. That meant structure, importance, a life she couldn't easily access. "Of course, darling, of course," she said, finally releasing my arm. Daniel gently steered me away, his hand a warm, steady presence on my lower back. We walked through the thinning crowd, past the hushed whispers and curious stares. I didn't feel triumphant or vindicated. I just felt quiet. The loud, angry noise that had lived in my head for 8 years, the one that replayed my family's rejection on a loop, had finally gone silent. We reached our car, a modest but comfortable sedan that was worlds away from the German luxury cars my father and sister drove. It was paid for. That was the only status symbol that mattered to me. The drive home was silent for the first 10 minutes. Daniel just drove, letting me process. I watched the manicured lawns of the wealthy suburbs give way to the more normal, cluttered streets of our neighborhood. I thought about my own children, Lily and Caleb, who were at a friend's house, blissfully unaware of the drama their grandparents had just endured. I had done this for them, to show them that their worth was not defined by a bank account or a family name, but by their character. "Are you okay?" Daniel finally asked, his voice soft. I turned to look at him. His profile was calm, his focus on the road. He was the man they said would ruin me. Instead, he had helped me build a world of my own, brick by brick, with love and hard work as the mortar. "I think so," I said honestly. "It doesn't feel like I thought it would. I thought I'd feel happy or angry. I just feel done. Like I finally closed a very heavy door." He reached over and squeezed my hand. "That's a good feeling to have." My father called Daniel, a scholarship kid, unforgivable. They cut me off for marrying the man I loved. What would you have done in my place? Comment your thoughts and share. As if on cue, my phone, which I'd left in the cup holder, began to buzz violently. The screen lit up with a name I hadn't seen in years. Father. My heart gave a painful jolt, a conditioned response from a lifetime of his summons. For a moment, I was that 22-year-old girl in his study again, small and terrified. "Don't answer it if you don't want to," Daniel said, his eyes flicking from the road to my face. I took a deep breath, the air steadying me. I wasn't that girl anymore. "No," I said, my voice firm. "I'm done being scared." I picked up the phone and pressed the green icon, putting it on speaker. Silence. Then a voice, cold and clipped, like ice cubes rattling in an empty glass. What did you think you were doing? It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. I was dedicating a new wing at my children's school, I replied, my tone even. I believe you were there. Don't be clever, Lauren, my father, John, snapped. You staged a public ambush. You took a moment that was meant to honor this family's legacy, and you turned it into a circus. Do you have any idea of the damage control I'm doing right now? The Harrisons were there. The board of the bank was there. I'm not responsible for your reputation, Father, I said calmly. You are. A legacy isn't something you inherit. It's something you build, and sometimes it needs a little renovation. A new voice cut in, high-pitched and choked with tears. My mother, Carol. Lauren, how could you? Your father is so... He's beside himself. You embarrassed us. You made us look like monsters. Did I? I asked, a genuine question. Or did I just hold up a mirror? For 8 years, you pretended I didn't exist. You told your friends I'd made a terrible mistake and was living in poverty. You never once called to see if that was true. You never met your grandchildren. That wasn't me making you look like anything. That was just you. There was a muffled sob on the other end. I could picture the scene perfectly. My father pacing his study, his face like thunder, while my mother collapsed onto a leather armchair, dabbing her eyes. Alexis was probably in the corner, texting furiously, feeding the drama. This is not over, John's voice returned, low and menacing. Your little stunt with the donation is meaningless. It's a rounding error for us, but public perception is everything. You've created a narrative that needs to be corrected. There will be a family dinner tomorrow night, 7 o'clock. You and your husband will be here. You will explain to the family what possessed you to do this. It wasn't an invitation. It was a royal decree. The old me would have stammered an apology and agreed. The old me would have been terrified of the consequences of refusing. But the old me was gone. I looked at Daniel, who gave a slight shake of his head, leaving the decision entirely to me. I smiled. No, I said into the phone. The word was simple, clean, and powerful. There was a stunned silence on the other end. I don't think he had ever heard that word from me before. What did you just say? He asked, his voice dangerously quiet. I said no, I repeated, feeling a lightness spread through my chest. We won't be there tomorrow, or any other night. My family is right here in this car. You had 8 years to be a part of it. The visiting hours are over. Goodbye, Father. Before he could respond, I ended the call. The silence that filled the car this time was different. It was peaceful. It was the sound of freedom. Daniel drove in silence for a few minutes, letting the weight of what I'd just done settle over us. My heart was pounding, a wild drumbeat of fear and exhilaration. I had hung up on my father. I had said no. For the first time in my 32 years, I had chosen my own peace over his approval. I watched the city lights blur past my window, each one a tiny star in a galaxy that I was finally navigating on my own terms. Are you okay? Daniel asked, his voice soft. He reached over and placed his hand on mine. His touch was warm, steady. It was the anchor I'd chosen 8 years ago, and it had never failed me. I turned to him, a real smile spreading across my face. I'm better than okay, I said, my voice thick with emotion. I'm free. He squeezed my hand. I'm proud of you, Lauren. That feeling of freedom lasted for about 12 hours. The next morning, my phone started buzzing. It was a notification from a social media app I barely used anymore. Then another and another. A friend from college had tagged me in a post. My stomach twisted as I opened it. It was from Alexis. She had posted a series of old photos of me. One from my awkward teenage years, complete with braces and a bad haircut. Another from a college party where I looked disheveled. But it was the caption that was the real poison. Throwing it back to simpler times, she wrote, before my little sister decided to trade her family for a fantasy. Some of us were worried sick for years, but it's so comforting to see she's landed on her feet with that big school donation. Makes you wonder where all that money came from so suddenly. Hope everything is above board, sending love and light. The insinuation was clear and venomous. She was painting me as a gold digger who had mysteriously come into money, implying Daniel and I were involved in something shady. The comments section was a viper's nest of our old social circle. People I hadn't spoken to in years were chiming in with fake concern and thinly veiled gossip. It was a public shaming, orchestrated by my own sister. My cheeks burned as if I'd been slapped. I threw the phone on the couch. Daniel came over and wrapped his arms around me. "Don't read it," he said. "It's just noise." "It's not just noise, Daniel," I whispered, leaning into him. "It's them. This is what they do. They can't control me anymore, so they're trying to destroy my reputation." I thought of my father, his cold, calculating eyes. He wouldn't stop at a social media post. This was just the opening shot. My father always used to say, "A weak foundation can't support a grand facade forever." I think he was talking about business, but it feels like he was describing our family. Their whole world is a facade. The next attack came 2 days later, and it was far more direct. Daniel came home from work looking pale. He dropped his briefcase by the door with a heavy thud. "What's wrong?" I asked immediately. He loosened his tie and sat down at the kitchen table, running a hand through his hair. "I had a meeting with my boss today, Frank." I waited. Daniel was a senior developer at a successful tech firm. He was respected, brilliant at his job. He'd never had issues at work. "He was weird," Daniel continued, struggling to find the words. "He asked a lot of questions about us, about our finances, about the school donation. He mentioned that one of the firm's biggest investors is a holding company with ties to your father's corporation." My blood ran cold. "No," I breathed. "He didn't say anything outright," Daniel said, his eyes meeting mine. But the message was clear. My performance is suddenly under a microscope. Projects are being scrutinized. My name was taken off the lead for the new cloud integration platform. They gave it to a junior developer. This was my father's work. I knew it as surely as I knew my own name. He couldn't force me to come to dinner, so he was going after my husband's career. He was trying to break the foundation of the life we had built, brick by brick, without a single dollar of his money. He wanted to prove that without him, we were nothing. He wanted to force us to come crawling back, begging for his help. The phone rang and Daniel flinched. He looked at the screen and his face tightened. "It's Frank," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "He wants to talk again." I watched him take the call, his back stiffening as he listened. I could see the confidence draining from his posture, replaced by a tense uncertainty. My father wasn't just trying to humiliate me anymore. He was trying to ruin us. And as I looked at the worried face of the man I loved, the man my family had despised for his lack of wealth, I felt a new kind of resolve harden in my chest. This was not over. They had just shown me how far they were willing to go. Now, it was my turn. Daniel hung up the phone without saying goodbye. He placed the smartphone on the counter with a quiet, deliberate motion, as if it were a fragile artifact. He stared out the kitchen window for a long moment. His shoulders slumped. The vibrant green of our backyard seemed to mock the gray that had settled over his face. "What did Frank say?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. I already knew it was bad. "I'm on a performance improvement plan," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "Effective immediately. They're assigning a junior developer to mentor me on the cloud integration platform, the one I designed." It was a corporate execution. A slow, humiliating process designed to break an employee's spirit until they quit, or to build a paper trail so thick that firing them was a formality. My father wasn't just trying to get Daniel fired. He was trying to professionally erase him, to make it look like he was incompetent, a fraud. It was a reflection of how my family had always seen him. "I'm so sorry, Daniel," I said, wrapping my arms around him from behind. I could feel the tension coiled in his back. "This is my fault. This is because of me." He turned and held me, burying his face in my hair. "No," he said, his voice muffled. "This isn't you. This is him. This is your father's cruelty. I don't know how to fight this, Lauren. He's a ghost. I can't see him, but he's everywhere. We stood there for a while, just holding on. The life we had built, this beautiful, quiet life filled with school runs and bedtime stories, felt like it was made of glass. And my father was standing outside with a hammer. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the living room, the soft glow of my laptop screen illuminating the stacks of financial reports I'd pulled up. I was looking into the holding company my father was using to pressure Daniel's firm. It was a maze of shell corporations and anonymous directors, a fortress of wealth designed to be impenetrable. I felt a wave of hopelessness wash over me. My father had been building this empire my whole life. What could I possibly do? Then I looked at the framed photo on the mantel. It was of me and Daniel on our wedding day. We were so young, so defiant, so sure we could take on the world. We had built our foundation on love and respect, not money and power. And then I remembered something. A phrase my father would repeat like a mantra during his business dealings, a piece of his cold philosophy that he offered up as wisdom. I remembered him saying it to a rival he was about to destroy. I remembered him saying it to me when I announced my engagement. My father always used to say, "A weak foundation can't support a grand facade forever." A small, cold smile touched my lips. He thought he was talking about his enemies. He thought he was talking about me. He never once thought he might be describing himself. His entire world was a grand facade of respectability, of old money and dynastic power. But somewhere, underneath all of it, there had to be a crack, a weak spot. And I would find it. For the next 2 days, I dug. I cross-referenced names, dates, and corporate filings. I went back decades, reading old business journals and newspaper archives. My father was meticulous about his public image, but the past was harder to erase completely. I was looking for the origin story of his empire, the first big deal that set him on his path. And I found it. A hostile takeover of a smaller family-run tech company nearly 30 years ago. It was the acquisition that gave him the capital to build everything else. The official story was that the company was failing and my father had swooped in as a savior. But as I read the fine print of old articles, I saw a different narrative. The family that owned the company had fought him bitterly. They accused him of corporate espionage, of stealing their proprietary code. They had filed a lawsuit, but it was mysteriously dropped. They disappeared from the business world, ruined and silenced. The name of their company was Innovatec. The holding company pressuring Daniel's firm had a subsidiary, a small, dormant one called Innovatec Solutions. It was a ghost, a name he thought was buried. Why would he keep it? Was it arrogance? Or was it a loose end he could never quite tie up? I kept digging into the old lawsuit. Most of the records were sealed, but I found a small local news report about the case being dismissed. It quoted the family's lawyer, who expressed shock at his client's sudden decision to drop the suit. The article mentioned one key detail. The lead programmer at Innovatec, the one who had developed their groundbreaking software, had suddenly changed his testimony. He went from being the family's star witness to claiming their code was worthless. The article didn't name him. It just referred to him as the lead developer. But I had a feeling. I went back to the website for Daniel's firm and looked at the executive leadership page. I scrolled down to the chief technology officer, a man who had been with the company since its inception. A man who was now Daniel's ultimate boss, several layers above Frank. His name was Arthur Evans, and in his official bio, it mentioned his first job out of college 30 years ago. He was the lead developer at a small startup called Innovatec. My father hadn't just buried a rival. He had bought his key witness, and that witness was now one of the most powerful men in Daniel's company. The foundation wasn't just weak. It was built on a lie. And I had just found the first hairline crack. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic, unsteady rhythm. Arthur Evans. The name echoed in my mind. It wasn't just a name on a corporate website anymore. It was a ghost from my father's past, a secret he had buried for 30 years. And now that ghost was sitting in a corner office, holding my husband's career in his hands. The irony was so cruel, so perfectly engineered, that it could only have been my father's design. He hadn't just put a target on Daniel's back. He'd made sure the man holding the weapon owed him everything. I closed the laptop, the soft click sounding like a gunshot in the silent house. I walked through the hallway, my bare feet cold on the hardwood floor. I peeked into my kids' rooms. Lily and Caleb were fast asleep, their chests rising and falling in the soft glow of their nightlights. They were so safe, so unaware of the storm that was gathering around our family. This was what I was fighting for. Not just for Daniel's job, but for this peace. This life we had built far away from my family's toxic influence. They wanted to see my kids at school now, to pretend to be grandparents after 8 years of silence. It was all a game to them, a way to exert control. I went back to our bedroom. Daniel was sleeping fitfully, his brow furrowed even in his sleep. I couldn't wake him. Not yet. I needed a plan, not just a horrifying discovery. I went back to the living room and opened my laptop again. I needed to find the family from Innovatech. The article had been vague, just referring to the founding family. I started searching for company records from 30 years ago, looking for the names of the original board members of Innovatech. It took hours, digging through digitized archives and old financial publications. Finally, I found them. The company was founded by two brothers, Eugene and Paul Peterson. They were the engineers, the visionaries. Their father, Harold Peterson, had provided the initial investment. They were the family my father had destroyed. I searched for their names, but they seemed to have vanished from the corporate world after the lawsuit. There were no new companies, no public profiles. It was as if they had been erased. But people don't just disappear. The next morning, I waited until the kids had left for school. I sat Daniel down at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee. His face was pale, and there were dark circles under his eyes. "I found something," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I turned my laptop around and showed him the bio of Arthur Evans, then the old news article, and finally the names of the Peterson family. I explained the connection, the timeline, the lawsuit that was suddenly dropped. I watched his face as he processed it all. He read every word, his eyes scanning the screen. At first, there was confusion, then dawning horror. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. "So my boss's boss," he started, his voice trailing off. "Is the man your father-in-law paid off 30 years ago to steal a company?" I finished for him. "And I'm willing to bet he's been on my father's payroll, in one way or another, ever since." Daniel was silent for a long time. He just stared at the screen. "What does this mean, Lauren? What can we even do with this? If we go to anyone at the company, Arthur Evans will just deny it. He'll say it's a crazy conspiracy theory. My father will back him up. They'll fire me and sue us for defamation." He was right. It was my word against 2 powerful, ruthless men. We had no proof, just a chain of suspicious coincidences. A direct attack was suicide. "It means we don't fight him at your company," I said, my resolve hardening. "We fight him in the past. We find the Petersons. Eugene, Paul, or any of their family. They were the victims. They might have evidence, documents, anything from the original lawsuit that they kept. They might be willing to talk." Daniel looked at me, a flicker of hope warring with the fear in his eyes. "After 30 years? Lauren, they're probably terrified of your father. He ruined them once. They won't want to go through that again." "Maybe," I admitted. "But maybe after 30 years, they're angry enough to want justice." I looked out the window, thinking of my father in his big office, believing he was untouchable. I remembered him standing over me on my wedding day, his face a mask of cold disappointment. He had built his entire world on secrets and intimidation, a grand facade of power and legacy. But as he always used to say, a weak foundation can't support a grand facade forever. Arthur Evans was a crack in that foundation. The Peterson family was another. And I was going to press on those cracks until the whole thing came crashing down. "Okay," Daniel said, finally nodding. "Okay, how do we find them?" That was the question. I had spent most of the night looking for them with no luck. But I had one more idea. The old lawsuit had a lawyer's name attached to it, a man named George Carlin. He was quoted in the article expressing his shock. He was their lawyer. If he was still alive, he might know where his clients went. It was a long shot, but it was the only one we had. I found an old legal directory and started searching for his name. And there it was. George Carlin, Esquire, still practicing law, right here in the city. The next day, I called George Carlin's office. The voice on the other end was a woman who sounded like she'd been answering that same phone for 40 years. I gave my name, Lauren, deliberately leaving off my last name, and said I needed to discuss a case from 30 years ago, Innovatech versus Northwood Industries. There was a long pause. I could hear papers rustling. Finally, she said, "Mr. Carlin can see you at 4 p.m. The line clicked dead. His office was in an old brick building downtown, the kind with a rickety elevator and hallways that smelled of dust and old paper. It was a world away from the gleaming glass and steel towers my father inhabited. The waiting room was small, filled with worn-out leather chairs and framed law degrees that had yellowed with age. George Carlin was a small, stooped man in his late 70s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He looked at me, then at Daniel, and gestured for us to sit. His desk was a chaotic landscape of stacked files and law books. "Innovatech," he said, his voice raspy. "I haven't heard that name spoken aloud in decades. You said your name was Lauren. Lauren who?" I took a deep breath. "Lauren Northwood." His eyes narrowed slightly. He leaned back in his chair, the old leather groaning in protest. "John Northwood's daughter. This gets more interesting by the second. What does the daughter of the man who destroyed my clients want with me?" "Justice," I said simply, "for your clients, and for my husband." I laid it all out for him. The pressure campaign against Daniel's firm, the impossible demands, the name Innovatech Solutions appearing in the corporate structure. I told him about Arthur Evans, the lead developer turned CTO, the star witness who had suddenly flipped. George Carlin listened without interrupting, his fingers steepled under his chin. He didn't seem surprised by any of it. When I finished, he was silent for a full minute, just studying my face. "Your father is a predator," he said finally. "In the wild, a predator takes down the weak. In the corporate world, he takes down the good. The Petersons were good men, brilliant engineers. They built something wonderful, and your father wanted it. So he took it. He broke them, not just financially, but spiritually." "I know," I whispered. "We need to find them. We think they might have kept records, evidence, anything that could help us." He shook his head slowly. "Even if you found them, why would they talk to you? To the daughter of the man who ruined them?" "They were threatened, Miss Northwood. Their families were threatened. They dropped that lawsuit because they were afraid. That fear doesn't just go away." "Because this time is different," I insisted, leaning forward. "This time, his own family is turning against him. My father taught me everything about his business, his strategies. He used to love telling me his mottos. He always said, 'A weak foundation can't support a grand facade forever.' He just never realized someone would find the cracks in his own foundation. Arthur Evans is a crack, and the Petersons are another." George Carlin stared at me, and for the first time I saw a flicker of something new in his eyes. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was a glimmer of hope. "That case?" he said, his voice softer now. "It haunted me. It was the biggest injustice of my career. Watching good people get crushed by a man with no morals and a bottomless bank account. Harold Peterson died of a heart attack 6 months after they lost the company. His sons, they just vanished." He stood up and walked over to a large, dusty filing cabinet in the corner of the room. He pulled out a drawer and began sifting through old, faded manila folders. "I tried to keep track of them for a while," he murmured, more to himself than to us. "Eugene and Paul, they moved away. Changed their names, I think. They wanted to disappear. And who could blame them?" He pulled out a thin folder and brought it back to his desk. He opened it carefully, as if it contained something fragile. Inside were a few old newspaper clippings and some handwritten notes. "I can't give you a direct line to Eugene or Paul. I honestly don't know where they are," he said. "But Eugene had a daughter. Her name is Nancy. She was just a little girl when all this happened. She's a grown woman now in her 30s, an architect. She lives a quiet life. She changed her last name to her mother's maiden name to distance herself from what happened." He wrote a name and an address on a small piece of paper and slid it across the desk toward me. Nancy Peterson, now Nancy Hayes. My hand trembled as I picked it up. It felt heavier than a simple piece of paper. It felt like a weapon. "Will she talk to us?" Daniel asked, his voice strained. "I don't know," George Carlin admitted. "She carries the weight of what your father did to her family. Seeing the name Northwood might be too much for her. But she's also Harold Peterson's granddaughter. She has his fire. If anyone is willing to fight, it might be her." He stood up, signaling the end of our meeting. "A word of advice," he said, his eyes locking onto mine. "Be careful. You are not just fighting a businessman. You are fighting an emperor. He has eyes and ears everywhere. He built his empire on destroying people who got in his way. He will not hesitate to do the same to you, daughter, or not." We walked out of the old building and into the late afternoon sun. The city noise felt distant, muffled. I looked down at the piece of paper in my hand. Nancy Hayes. A name. A hope. A ghost from a past my father thought he had buried forever. And now we were about to go knocking on her door. The drive to Nancy Hayes' address was quiet. Daniel kept clenching and unclenching his hands on the steering wheel. I held the piece of paper with her name on it, the ink feeling like a brand on my fingers. Her home was in a quiet, tree-lined suburb, a world away from the cold, imposing mansions of my childhood. It was a modest but beautiful craftsman-style house, with a garden full of wildflowers in the front yard. It felt like a home built with care, not just money. We walked up the stone path and I took a deep breath before ringing the doorbell. A moment later, the door opened. A woman with kind, intelligent eyes and dark hair pulled back from her face looked at us. She was probably my age, maybe a few years older. She wore a simple t-shirt and jeans, both smudged with what looked like charcoal. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice polite but cautious. "Are you Nancy Hayes?" I asked. "I am," she replied, her eyes flicking between me and Daniel. "My name is Lauren Northwood," I said. It was like a switch flipped. The warmth in her eyes vanished, replaced by a cold, hard shield. Her body tensed and her hand tightened on the doorknob. "I think you have the wrong house." She started to close the door. "Please," I said, putting my hand out. "Don't. My father destroyed your family. Now he's trying to do the same thing to mine. I need your help to stop him." The door stopped moving. Nancy stared at me, her expression a mixture of shock, suspicion, and a deep, old pain. She looked at Daniel, then back at me. After a long, tense silence, she pulled the door open. "You have 5 minutes." Her living room was her studio. Architectural models of incredible, futuristic buildings sat on every surface. Blueprints were pinned to the walls. It was the space of a creator, someone who built things. The exact opposite of my father, who only knew how to tear them down. We told her everything. We started with Innovatech and the stolen company, and ended with the pressure campaign against Daniel, the impossible deadlines, and the man connecting it all, Arthur Evans. Nancy listened without a word, her face unreadable. When we finished, she walked over to a large window overlooking her garden. "My father, Eugene, never spoke about it," she said, her back to us. "Not really, but it was always there, a ghost in our house. He stopped designing. He stopped creating. He took a simple accounting job and just faded. My grandfather Harold died 6 months after it happened. My dad always said he died of a broken heart." She turned to face us and her eyes were glistening. "Your father didn't just take their company. He took their souls. Why should I help you? So you can save your husband's job? What about the life my family lost?" "Because it's not just about Daniel's job anymore," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "It's about justice. For your father. For your grandfather. For everyone my father has ever crushed to get what he wanted." I remembered George Carlin's words. He broke them spiritually. I saw that broken spirit reflected in Nancy's eyes. She was quiet for a long time. Then, she walked over to an old wooden chest in the corner of the room and lifted the lid. "My father kept everything," she said softly. "He couldn't talk about it, but he couldn't let it go either." She pulled out a dusty, leather-bound journal. He wrote in this every night. She handed it to me. My hands trembled as I opened it. It was Eugene Peterson's journal. Page after page detailed the birth of Innovatech, the excitement, the hope. And then, the entries about my father, John Northwood. He described my father's charm, his promises of partnership. Then the tone shifted. He wrote about my father's sudden change, the legal threats, the impossible demands. And then we found it. An entry dated a week after they lost the company. Arthur betrayed us, Eugene had written. He testified that our core navigation algorithm was his own design. But I have the original schematics, the ones I drew 6 months before Arthur was even hired. I showed them to John, trusted him with them. He must have given them to Arthur. It was all a setup. It was the proof. The smoking gun. My father had orchestrated the entire theft, using Arthur Evans as his pawn and weapon. 2 weeks later, we were standing in the grand ballroom of the Beverly Wilshire Hotel. It was the annual Northwood Industries Charity Gala, my father's biggest night of the year. He was on stage, basking in the applause, the perfect image of the powerful philanthropist. Daniel, Nancy, and I made our way through the crowd. When he finished his speech, I approached him. Alexis and my mother, Carol, were at his side. "Lauren," he said, his voice cold. "I'm surprised to see you here." "I'm full of surprises," I said. "Father, I'd like you to meet someone. This is Nancy Peterson." The name hit him like a physical blow. The color drained from my father's face. He stared at Nancy, speechless. "You might remember her father, Eugene," I continued, my voice clear and steady. "And her grandfather, Harold. The men you stole Innovatech from." "This is ridiculous," he stammered, trying to regain his composure. I held up a copy of Eugene's journal. "Is it? Because this journal tells a very different story. A story about fraud, perjury, and theft. A story that a certain journalist from the New York Times found very interesting." At that exact moment, a wave of notification chimes swept through the ballroom. Phones lit up. I saw the headline on the screen of a man standing near us. "Northwood Empire, a house of cards? Tech giant accused of 30-year fraud." My father's business partners, the ones who had been clapping him on the back moments before, were now reading the article, their faces turning from admiration to horror. They began to step away from him, creating a circle of isolation around my family. My mother looked like she was going to faint. Alexis just stared, her mouth open in disbelief. My father looked at me, his eyes burning with pure hatred. He had built his entire world on a foundation of lies and intimidation, and I had just pulled the cornerstone out. I leaned in close. "As you always said, Father," I whispered, so only he could hear. "A weak foundation can't support a grand facade forever." I turned and walked away, Daniel and Nancy by my side, leaving him alone in the ruins of the empire he had built on the wreckage of other people's dreams. We didn't look back, from a ghost to their downfall. My father's empire, built on others' dreams, is now in ruins. He looked at me with pure hatred as I walked away. What did you think of my revenge? Subscribe for more intense stories of justice.